Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Američka podrška Izraelu varira ovisno o stranačkoj pripadnosti, uprkos činjenici da većina pozitivno gleda na Izrael proteklih decenija. Ipak, Izrael konstantno uživa veću naklonost među republikancima. Galupove ankete otkrivaju da su Amerikanci koji su religiozniji više proizraelski nastrojeni. Prema posljednjoj anketi, 85% republikanaca ima pozitivne stavove o Izraelu u odnosu na 77% među nezavisnima i 64% među demokratama. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo razloge tako snažne podrške Izraelu, naročito podršku američkih medija. Ali prije toga, pogledajmo detaljnije američku vojnu podršku Izraelu.
How are US tax dollars being spent on Israel?
Another strike on that tower.
Through a lot of military funding. Since Israel's creation in 1948, the United States has provided $236 billion in aid and missile defense funding. Human rights groups say the Israeli army has been using US-made military equipment to attack Gaza. In May 2021, Israeli air raids killed 200 people in Gaza during the first week of violence. Dozens were children. It's why people are increasingly asking, why does the US continue to be complicit in Israel's violation of human rights?
Occupation no more!
Each year, the US gives Israel $3.8 billion in military aid. That's $38 billion total, signed in a 10-year agreement between Israel and the US. To put this military assistance in perspective, annually, it's $1 billion more aid than the US spent in the fight against the climate crisis. When you do the numbers, it means the average individual US taxpayer gives $26 in military assistance to Israel each year. It's the cost of paying 47,000 elementary school teachers in the US. This hefty US military assistance ensures Israel's military is one of the most technologically sophisticated in the world. You're looking at the most advanced fighter jet ever made. Israel used US grants to purchase the lion's share of its F-35 Joint Strike fighters. And this is Iron Dome, Israel's missile defense system. Israeli officials say around 90% of Hamas rockets were intercepted by Iron Dome during a week of fighting in mid-May 2021. Between 2011 and 2020, the US invested $1.6 billion into Iron Dome batteries, interceptors, co-production costs, and general maintenance. On top of the military funds the US already provides, in May 2021, the Biden administration approved an additional $735 million weapon sale to Israel. This came as Israeli attacks on Gaza intensified.
Because, my friends, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, non-violent Palestinian activists struggle against the daily violence and harassment of occupation. Violence and harassment subsidized, by the way, with billions of US taxpayer dollars.
US military assistance to Israel also includes joint military exercises, research, and weapons development. Now, Israel ranks as one of the top arms exporters in the world. The state has exported missile defense systems, drones, and cybersecurity products to countries including India, Brazil, the US, and Russia. But it's not just arms that the US gives to Israel. American governments have historically been staunch allies of the Israeli counterparts on the international stage. This includes blocking resolutions that challenge Israel's violations, like building illegal settlements, and blocking attempts to hold Israel accountable for war crimes in Gaza.
There has not been a significant overreaction.
In the span of 1 week, Washington vetoed UN Security Council calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, not once, not twice, but 3 times. President Biden only added to calls for a ceasefire after 8 days of violence. In fact, the US opposes the International Criminal Court's investigation into alleged war crimes in the occupied territories. Now, US interests in the Middle East might be waning, but Israel's security is still a cornerstone of US foreign policy. Here's what US Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to say.
As we've said before, Israel has the right to defend itself. There is no equivalence between a terrorist group indiscriminately firing rockets at civilians and a country defending its people from those attacks.
Publicly, the US focused on civilian deaths from Hamas rockets, there's no mention of Palestinians killed in Gaza or occupation. This is part of a bigger problem. For decades, the US has said it supports a peace process, but it's continued to block any efforts to stop Israel's systematic violations of international law. This has been happening simultaneously as Palestinians experience increasing dispossession and oppression. This is why Palestinians don't see the US as an honest broker in the conflict. In an effort to pressure Israel to follow international law, Palestinians and their allies have been calling for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israeli goods. But in the US, this form of resistance has been targeted. Many US states are using anti-boycott laws and executive orders to punish companies that refuse to do business with illegal Israeli settlements.
Palestinians' rights to nonviolent resistance have been curtailed and even criminalized. Our party leaders have spoken forcefully against BDS, calling its proponents anti-Semitic, despite the same tactics being critical to ending the South African apartheid mere decades ago.
So what happens now? Historically, there's been robust bipartisan support for Israel in Congress. From military sales to the fact the US was first to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in 2017. But now, things might be changing. Domestic support for Israel is facing more scrutiny.
And colleagues, Palestinians aren't going anywhere no matter how much money you send to Israel's apartheid government.
For the first time, the US has a Palestinian-American woman in Congress, in Representative Rashida Tlaib, and she has support. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a group of progressive Democrats introduced a resolution aimed at blocking the recent $735 million arms sale to Israel, and the pressure against taxpayer funds toward Israel continues.
Posljednjih godina izraelski doseljenici i desničarski političari su u više navrata u pratnji policije upadali u kompleks džamije Al-Aqsa bez palestinskog odobrenja. Upadi su dovodili do velikih sukoba sa Palestincima. Ekstremni izraelski desničari zagovaraju rušenje džamije Al-Aqsa i izgradnju trećeg jevrijskog hrama.
Jerusalem is at the heart of three religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But since occupying East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has aimed to ensure the city has a Jewish majority.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No!
To Palestinians who have been living under occupation and denied equality for decades, Al-Aqsa isn't just Islam's third holiest site, it's a symbol of their nationhood. Jews call Al-Aqsa the Temple Mount because it's believed to be the site where two ancient Jewish temples once stood. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans roughly 2,000 years ago, but until then it had been the center of Jewish worship, the holiest place for Jews. Still, even after they occupied the site in 1967, Israeli authorities maintained a policy that Jews should not pray there and that only Muslims can. But that might be changing. And these people are driving that. They belong to various groups that make up what's generally referred to as the Temple Mount movement. Their ultimate goal is to demolish the mosque, this symbol of Palestinian nationhood, this sacred site to Muslims worldwide, and build a third Jewish temple there. And they're pretty open about their plans.
For 34 years, the Temple Institute has been preparing for the rebuilding of the Holy Temple and the renewal of the divine service.
They've even got detailed architectural renderings of what the temple would look like. They receive financial support from the Israeli government and charities in the US, Canada, and the UK. In recent years, they've even offered cash rewards to Jews who enter the Al-Aqsa compound or slaughter animals there, which was part of Jewish ritual at the original temple. For decades, these activists were dismissed by most Israelis and constrained by the government. But that was then.
So a few years ago, this was considered fringe?
Zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream.
Yehuda Glick is one of the movement's most prominent figures, and he served in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. He's not the only one to reach that office.
10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who ascended Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 of the Knesset members.
It's become common for government ministers and leaders, and even the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, to talk about imposing Jewish prayers at Al-Aqsa. Until the early 2000s, the number of Israeli Jews who entered the Al-Aqsa compound was very small, maybe a few dozen a year. But as the Temple Mount movement has moved into the mainstream, that number has recently grown to tens of thousands a year. With the Israeli government increasingly allowing the status quo at Al-Aqsa to change, the worry is that things are going in one direction, towards a situation where Palestinian access to it is restricted even more, the way it has been at another holy site in the wake of a bloody mass killing. Here's that story. 20 miles south of Jerusalem is the Israeli-occupied city of Hebron, where the prophet Abraham is believed to be buried with members of his family under this building. Abraham is a central figure for both Jews and Muslims. That's why Jews call this site the Cave of the Patriarchs, and Muslims refer to it as the Ibrahimi Mosque. After the occupation began in 1967, Hebron was the first place that Israelis settled in violation of international law. Jews and Muslims both prayed at the site, but the situation was volatile. On the morning of February 25, 1994, hundreds of Palestinian Muslims were praying at the Ibrahimi Mosque. An American-born Israeli settler, a reservist in the Israeli army carrying an automatic rifle, entered the mosque, waited for worshippers to kneel down in prayer, and then started shooting. Baruch Goldstein killed 29 people and injured more than 120. One witness described how there were bodies and blood everywhere. Goldstein's massacre ended when the survivors hit him with a fire extinguisher and beat him to death. The injured were rushed to hospitals, which were overwhelmed. And as news of the killing spread, protests broke out across Hebron. Israeli soldiers opened fire, killing more than 20 additional Palestinians in the following days. While we were researching this story, we came across a letter published in the New York Times in 1981. The author notes the difference between Palestinian and Israeli birth rates. The solution, he writes, is for Israel to, quote, act decisively to remove the Arab minority from within its borders. The letter was written by Baruch Goldstein 2 years before he left the United States for Israel. Goldstein joined the Israeli military and became an army doctor, but often refused to treat non-Jews. He joined an anti-Arab political party called kakva that was later banned for inciting racism. He lived and was eventually buried in Kiryat Arba, an illegal Israeli settlement in Hebron. The settlers there strongly believe that Hebron should be theirs alone.
I think that his act brought a lot of security to the Jewish people here in Hebron and Kiryat Arba.
After the massacre, the settlement's chief rabbi described Goldstein as holier than all the martyrs of the Holocaust. Goldstein's grave is often visited by supporters, and his tombstone reads, "He gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah and land." The massacre led to big changes in Hebron at the expense of its victims, the Palestinians. Under the pretext of securing the settlers who lived in the old city and preventing more violence, the Israeli army imposed a 2-week curfew on all of Hebron's Palestinians. It made the area around the Ibrahimi Mosque permanently off-limits to everyone except settlers and foreign tourists. This had been a bustling marketplace, a commercial center for Palestinian life. But after the massacre, these shopfronts were welded shut by the Israeli army. The old city is now cut off from the rest of Hebron by dozens of Israeli checkpoints, making it very difficult for most Palestinians to get there or pray at the mosque. Israel also forcibly divided the Ibrahimi Mosque, 40% for Muslims and 60% for Jews, but all of it under full Israeli military control. Basically, the settlers won. And here's how that story is connected to today. Palestinians fear that what happened in Hebron in 1994 could be repeated in Jerusalem. It's not just about the possibility of another massacre, but the fact that the people who share Baruch Goldstein's beliefs have more power than ever in Israel. For example, the banned political party Goldstein was part of has rebranded. Some of its former members joined new parties and are now in the Israeli Knesset. They're drafting and passing laws and are part of the ruling coalition government. Take the Otzma Yehudit party, for instance. Its platform explicitly calls for Palestinians to leave, saying it'll work to remove the enemies of Israel from our country. It also calls for Israeli sovereignty and ownership to be imposed over the Temple Mount. And its leader had a photograph of Baruch Goldstein hanging on his living room wall.
זה החלום. זה החלום שהתגשם בעזרת השם.
הבעיה שיש שם, כרגע יש שם משהו אחר, אתה יודע, איתמר.
כרגע. הדגש הוא על הכרגע.
For Palestinians, that's a call to cut them off from Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, and another threat to their very presence on this land. Most of the world's governments, including Israel's biggest backer, the United States, have insisted for decades that a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians would include a formula for dividing or sharing Jerusalem. But as the Israeli government moves steadily in the opposite direction, the US hasn't pushed back. Instead, it's done things that Israel believes strengthens its claims over the entire city, like moving the US embassy into Jerusalem. But if nothing is done to stop this trend, the consequences might be felt far beyond the Holy Land.
Na kraju, pogledajmo kako američki mediji izvještavaju o izraelsko-palestinskim sukobima i koliko proizraelski lobi utječe na njihovo izvještavanje.
Covering Israeli occupation and apartheid seemed to be excruciatingly difficult for many major media outlets, especially here in the United States. There's a lot of sanitization of language, whitewashing of the situation, and an erasure of the real power imbalance that exists between Israelis and Palestinians, even an erasure of Palestinian humanity.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
We've seen this type of rocket fire during major operations and major wars.
Violence spiraling out of control in the Middle East, fires in Tel Aviv, military strikes, a neighborhood in Gaza. That began as a land dispute in Jerusalem.
Since May 11th, the Israeli military has been bombing Gaza. The airstrikes followed an escalation of ongoing Israeli state violence when worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem were attacked by Israeli police during the last days of Ramadan. And this was following ongoing Palestinian resistance against the forced and illegal displacement of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem to make room for more Israeli settlers, a situation that isn't unique to this neighborhood. Almost immediately, English-language news media, especially U.S. outlets, chose a side under their guise of objectivity, and we can see it in the language that's been used. State-sponsored illegal forced displacement became evictions, something Mohammed Al-Kurd, a resident and writer from Sheikh Jarrah, called out on CNN.
To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law.
Israeli police attacks on Palestinian Muslim worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque became tensions or clashes, a term which not only erases the genesis of the violence an occupying state force inflicts on the people it occupies, but also obscures the power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians. A decades-long Israeli occupation of Palestine and a now recognized system of apartheid becomes a conflict, another term which presents the occupier and the occupied as equals. The Israeli military assault on Gaza, which at the time of filming this has claimed over 230 Palestinian lives, becomes a war between a heavily armed country and the people living on a tiny strip of land that it occupies. And if the war isn't with Gaza, then the war is with Hamas, whose military wing is up against one of the world's most technologically advanced and well-funded militaries, which is also the only country in the region with nuclear capabilities. And I'll throw it to John Oliver to quickly explain why Hamas rockets and Israeli bombs just don't make for a meeting of equals.
The use of the phrase tit-for-tat war in a conflict where you just pointed out one side has suffered over 10 times the casualties. Something which speaks to both the severe power imbalance at play here and how that often gets obscured by how we choose to talk about it.
In addition to sanitized language, there is also the passive voice, which suddenly becomes dominant in an industry where that's a big grammatical no-no. Palestinians aren't killed by Israeli bombs. They die. Israelis, however, are killed. Buildings aren't destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. They collapse after Israeli airstrikes. And mainstream coverage, even when it's good, like the Last Week Tonight segment, still often presents current events devoid of 7 decades of context. The recent events in Jerusalem can't simply be reduced to a flare-up or an escalation. Describing these events in this way and demanding a restoration of calm, whatever that means, diminishes the greatest act of violence that is inflicted on Palestinians on a daily basis: the occupation. All coverage and context needs to go back to that. Sheikh Jarrah does not exist in and of itself. It exists in the context of 7 decades of settler colonialism, whose purpose has been the dispossession and subjugation of the indigenous population. Attacks on Al-Aqsa don't exist in and of themselves, but are part and parcel of a long-existing Israeli strategy to dismantle and discourage Palestinian mass gatherings. This is especially true in this particular case when the attack followed protests against the continuing state-backed Judaicization of Jerusalem by forcing out the Palestinian population. And we can't talk about the West Bank without talking about how, among almost 3 million Palestinians, there are more than 700,000 illegal Israeli settlers. We can't talk about Jerusalem without pointing out how the Israeli-controlled city has a policy of keeping the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews 40-60. That's an official policy to ensure Jewish dominance of the city. And then Gaza? We can't talk about Gaza without mentioning that it's a small strip of land the size of Detroit, home to 2 million Palestinians. There is no official border that demarcates it, and it's under siege from Israel by land, air, and water. Of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, 1.4 million are refugees who were expelled from or fled their homes due to the ethnic cleansing campaign carried out by Jewish militias before Israel's creation in 1948. These refugees, like all Palestinian refugees, were blocked by Israel from ever returning to their homes despite the United Nations demanding that they be allowed to. Now, American mainstream coverage of Israel, of occupied Palestine, isn't surprising when we look at how closely aligned the media establishment is with not only the American government, but its foreign policy interests. It's the same reason that this happened, that the American mainstream uncritically reported and amplified an Israeli strategy to make Hamas think that the military was going to do a ground invasion. And Israeli and pro-Israeli voices and perspectives dominate cable news shows and even daytime shows, despite the vast amount of Palestinian commentators available.
Do the Palestinians, even though they don't have a state, do they have the right to defend themselves?
What do you mean? They have the right to defend themselves from who? We are not attacking Palestinians.
What we have here is a terrorist organization, Hamas, on one side, and our ally, democratic ally, Israel on the other side, and therefore we have a responsibility to support Israel and its right to defend itself.
And it's not surprising that the New York Times, the leading newspaper of record, continues to use language and reporting which, at best, equalizes Palestinian and Israeli violence and suffering, and at worst, dehumanizes Palestinians. Since 1984, every New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief has lived in a West Jerusalem home that was ethnically cleansed of its inhabitants during the Nakba, which is what Palestinians call what happened in 1948. And the Times also has had staff and reporters covering the occupation in various capacities who have children who served in the IDF. How many Palestinian Jerusalem bureau chiefs has the Times had? How many Palestinian staff reporters does it have on the ground? Or how many Palestinian ground reporters does any other major American newspaper or cable outlet have on the ground? Now, everything that I just laid out might make the situation seem so incredibly dire, but this time there has been a bit of a shift.
This is a war crime. This is ethnic cleansing. You know, they can do all their propaganda and say that this is a private land dispute, but it doesn't take much looking at the history of this country and seeing how this country came about. It came about by stealing people's homes and stealing people's lands and destroying people's villages.
Palestinians are, at best, third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable.
United Jerusalem is a city that is a success story and will continue to be so.
Okay, well, according to Israeli reports, only 7% of the building permits issued in Jerusalem over the past few years have gone to Palestinians. They make up 40% of the city's population.
What we need is more than the cessation of violence. We need sanctions against Israel in order to put pressure on one of our time's apartheid regimes.
For the record, destroying a civilian residence sure seems like a war crime, regardless of whether you send a courtesy heads-up text.
Bolstered by the recent Human Rights Watch report, which supports what Palestinians have said for decades, terms like apartheid and ethnic cleansing have made it into the mainstream. And while there is a long way to go to significantly shift the narrative into one which doesn't give equal time, space, and moral footing to the occupied and the occupier, there are some suggestions that we are witnessing a change. And there is a part of me that wonders, in addition to the rising tide of progressive politics, how much of a role did the reckoning over racism in the U.S. media last summer following the George Floyd protests have to play in some of these changes? What we're seeing today is that Israel's structural racism and violence are no longer deniable. And both those who watch the news and those who make the news are boldly challenging the media and political establishment to call out Israeli apartheid and to stop protecting it and enabling it.
Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom specijalnom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka o Palestini i američkoj podršci Izraelu. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.